The radio crackled with desperation at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Bagram Airfield like a blade. Any station, any station, this is Viper 6. We have casualties, taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate close air support. Grid reference follows. The voice belonged to a Navy SEAL team leader pinned down in the Korangal Valley, his words carrying the weight of men dying in darkness 3,000 feet below the sleeping mountains of Afghanistan. Captain Raven, Switchblade Kellner, rolled off her cot in the pilot's quarters, combat boots hitting concrete before her eyes fully opened. Around her, other A-10 pilots stirred but didn't move. The night belonged to the helicopters and the special operations community, or so conventional wisdom dictated. But conventional wisdom had never met Switchblade. She grabbed her flight gear, muscle memory guiding her hands through the ritual of preparation. Helmet, survival vest, sidearm. The nickname had followed her from flight school, not because she was small and compact like the folding knife, but because of how she appeared when you least expected it, cutting deep and disappearing before anyone knew what hit them. The operations center buzzed with controlled chaos. Duty officers hunched over radios and computer screens, their faces painted blue by the glow of tactical displays. Colonel Marcus Hendricks, the wing commander, stood at the center of it all, his weathered face etched with concern. He'd been flying combat missions since Desert Storm, and the tone in that SEAL's voice told him everything he needed to know about the situation developing in the valley. "Sir, I can take this one," Switchblade said, her voice cutting through the radio chatter. Several heads turned, expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism. She was the only female A-10 pilot in the squadron, a fact that seemed to follow her like shadow wherever she went. Hendricks studied her for a moment. At 28, Raven Kellner had more combat hours than pilots twice her age, but tonight felt different. The weather was deteriorating, the mountains were unforgiving, and the enemy was dug in deep. "Negative, Switchblade. We'll wait for sunrise and send a full package." But the radio crackled again, and this time the desperation was unmistakable. "Any station, this is Viper 6. We have 4 KIA, multiple WAA. We need help now, or we're not making it to sunrise." The transmission ended with the distant sound of automatic weapons fire and the hollow thump of mortars impacting near the radio operator's position. Switchblade met Hendricks' eyes across the operations center. In that moment, protocol and procedure meant nothing. Somewhere in the darkness, American warriors were dying, and she held the keys to the only aircraft on base capable of providing the precise, devastating firepower they needed to survive. The colonel's nod was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Within minutes, she was running toward the flight line, her breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air, knowing that 18 Navy SEALs were counting on a voice they'd never heard to answer their desperate call with 30mm guns. The pre-flight inspection took 4 minutes, a record even by her standards. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its titanium armor gleaming under the floodlights. This particular aircraft, tail number 8010999, had been her mount for 8 months. She knew every rivet, every system, every quirk of its twin turbofan engines. The Warthog wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was perfect for one purpose: keeping ground forces alive when everything else failed. As she strapped into the cockpit, Switchblade felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders. The aircraft systems came alive with her touch: hydraulics, flight controls, targeting pod, and most importantly, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the nose. 3,900 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition, capable of shredding tanks and obliterating fortified positions with surgical precision. The tower cleared her for immediate departure, and the twin engines spooled up with their characteristic whistle. As she taxied toward the active runway, other pilots emerged from their quarters, drawn by the sound of an unscheduled night launch. They watched from the flight line as Switchblade advanced the throttles and lifted off into the darkness, her aircraft's navigation lights disappearing into the storm clouds gathering around the peaks. The flight to the Korangal Valley took 18 minutes, but it felt like hours. Weather radar painted a picture of towering thunderheads and severe turbulence ahead, while the secure radio frequency carried increasingly desperate transmissions from the SEAL team. Viper 6's voice had grown hoarse, his updates more frequent as his perimeter contracted under relentless enemy pressure. "Switchblade, this is Overlord," came the voice of the airborne controller orbiting high above the valley. "Be advised, we have multiple hostile positions confirmed. Friendlies are marked with infrared strobes, but visibility is near zero down there. You sure you want to take this one?" She keyed her microphone with deliberate calm. "Overlord, Switchblade, roger that. I've got 18 Americans who need to go home tonight. I'm going in." The controller's acknowledgement was terse, professional, but she could hear the doubt in his voice. Night-close air support in mountainous terrain during a storm wasn't a mission for the faint-hearted, and everyone on the frequency knew it. As she approached the valley, Switchblade began her descent through the cloud layer, relying entirely on instruments as the world outside her canopy disappeared into gray-black nothing. The A-10's targeting pod painted thermal images on her multifunction display, revealing the battlefield below in stark black and white. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions, the heat signatures of vehicles, and somewhere in the center of it all, the tiny infrared strobes marking friendly positions. The mountains rose around her like the walls of a cathedral, their peaks invisible in the storm but marked clearly on her terrain-following radar. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and she would become another casualty statistic. But somewhere below, 18 Navy SEALs were fighting for their lives, and that knowledge burned away every trace of fear or hesitation. "Viper 6, Switchblade. I'm overhead with 30 Mike and Mavericks. Give me a sitrep and target locations." Her voice over the radio was steady, professional, carrying no hint of the adrenaline coursing through her system. This was what she had trained for, what every simulation and exercise had prepared her for, the moment when theory became deadly reality. The SEAL team leader's response came through heavy static, punctuated by the crack of rifle fire. "Switchblade, thank God. We've got hostiles in prepared positions on 3 sides. Heavy machine guns, RPGs, and what looks like a recoilless rifle. My guys are down to their last magazines, and we've got wounded who need immediate evac." He rattled off grid coordinates with the precision of a man who knew that accuracy meant survival. Switchblade rolled into her first attack run, the A-10's nose dropping toward the valley floor as she lined up on the northernmost enemy position. Through her targeting pod, she could see the thermal bloom of a heavy machine gun firing down into the SEAL position. The crosshairs settled on target, and she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with its distinctive sound, like fabric tearing, but amplified 1,000 times. 65 rounds of depleted uranium ammunition chewed through the enemy position in 2 seconds, silencing the machine gun permanently. "Good hits, Switchblade," came the excited voice from below. "That's one down. We've still got problems to the east and south." The relief in the SEAL leader's voice was palpable, but Switchblade knew the hardest part was just beginning. The enemy would be adjusting, moving, trying to bring anti-aircraft weapons to bear on her vulnerable aircraft. She banked hard left, pulling 4GS as she set up for another attack run. The storm was worsening, rain lashing her canopy and lightning illuminating the clouds around her. But below, muzzle flashes continued to strobe in the darkness, and American voices called for help over the radio. There was nowhere else she'd rather be, nothing else she'd rather be doing. This was her element, her purpose, her calling written in tracers and thunder. Banking into her second attack run, Switchblade felt the familiar calm that settled over her during combat. Time seemed to slow, her senses sharpened to razor edges. She could hear every radio transmission, feel every vibration through the aircraft's controls, see every detail painted by the targeting pod's thermal imagery. The enemy position to the east revealed itself as a cluster of fighters around a recoilless rifle, their body heat glowing white against the cool mountain earth. Viper 6, guns inbound from the east, she transmitted, her finger finding the trigger as the Pipper settled on target. This burst was longer, 90 rounds that walked across the enemy position like the footsteps of an angry giant. When the smoke cleared, the thermal imagery showed only cooling metal and still forms scattered across the rocky ground. But her attacks had drawn attention. Tracer rounds began reaching up toward her aircraft, their lazy arcs deceiving in their apparent slowness. At 500 feet above ground level, she was well within range of small arms fire, and the A-10's titanium bathtub could only protect her from so much. Anti-aircraft artillery began bracketing her position, dark puffs of flak appearing in her peripheral vision. "Taking fire," she reported matter-of-factly, even as metal fragments pinged off her canopy. Continuing attacks on remaining positions. The professionalism in her voice masked the controlled violence of her maneuvers as she jinked and weaved through the defensive fire, using every trick learned in a decade of flying the Warthog through hostile skis. The southern position proved more challenging. As she rolled in for her third attack run, a surface-to-air missile streaked up from the valley floor, a shoulder-fired SA-7, its infrared seeker locked onto her exhaust signature. Switchblade deployed flares and chaff while pulling into a steep climb, feeling the missile detonate close enough to rattle her teeth. Shrapnel peppered the A-10's armored underside, but the tough aircraft absorbed the damage and kept flying. "That was close," muttered Overlord from his safe perch at 20,000 feet, but Switchblade was already rolling into another attack, her jaw set with determination. The men on the ground didn't have the luxury of altitude and distance. They needed her here, in the weeds, trading fire with an enemy that wanted nothing more than to add an American aircraft to their collection of trophies. The final enemy position crumbled under her fourth gun run, but the battle was far from over. Intelligence reports crackled over the radio. Enemy reinforcements were moving toward the valley from 3 different directions. Viper 6's ammunition was critically low, his wounded were deteriorating, and the weather was making helicopter evacuation impossible. What had begun as a rescue mission was evolving into something far more complex and dangerous. "Switchblade, be advised," came the voice of Overlord. "We're showing heavy weather moving in from the west. You've got maybe 30 minutes before this whole valley socks in completely." The implication was clear. If she didn't extract those seals soon, they would all be trapped together when the storm arrived in full force. She keyed her microphone while scanning her fuel gauges and ammunition counters. Half her 30 mic was expended. She had 4 Mavericks remaining, and enough fuel for perhaps 45 minutes of combat operations. Against her, an estimated 40 to 60 enemy fighters were converging on the valley, bringing heavy weapons and the kind of firepower that could overwhelm even the most elite special operations team. "Roger that, Overlord. Viper 6, what's your status on movement to alternate landing zone?" The alternate LZ was 2 kilometers to the south, a small clearing barely large enough for a helicopter, but offering better defensive positions than their current location. Getting there would mean moving wounded men across broken terrain while under fire, a nightmare scenario for any ground commander. "Negative, Switchblade. We've got 3 litter cases who can't be moved without proper medevac. We're staying put until the cavalry arrives." The resignation in the SEAL leader's voice was unmistakable. He was making the tactical decision to fort up and fight it out, knowing that movement would likely kill the wounded men he'd sworn to protect. As if summoned by his words, the first enemy reinforcements appeared on her targeting pod, a technical vehicle mounting a heavy machine gun, racing across the valley floor toward the SEAL position. Switchblade rolled into an immediate attack, her remaining Maverick missiles finding targets with lethal precision. The vehicle disappeared in a ball of flame, but 3 more appeared behind it, and she could see infantry moving through the rocks on foot. The mathematics of combat were stark and unforgiving. 18 American warriors against increasingly overwhelming odds, supported by a single aircraft that was running low on everything that mattered. But as she pulled into another attack run, Switchblade felt something that surprised her, not fear but fierce joy. This was what the A-10 had been built for, what she had been trained for. In this moment, she was exactly where she belonged. The enemy had learned from their earlier losses and adapted their tactics. Instead of clustering in obvious positions, they spread out among the rocks, making targeting more difficult. They coordinated their anti-aircraft fire, forcing her to spend precious seconds maneuvering instead of engaging. Most dangerously, they had brought more surface-to-air missiles, and she could see the distinctive heat signatures of multiple MA and PAD teams moving into position around the valley. Viper 6, I'm seeing SAM teams deploying around your position, she warned. This is about to get interesting. As if to punctuate her words, another missile streaked up from the valley floor, forcing her into violent, evasive maneuvers that left her momentarily disoriented. The A-10 groaned under the stress, but held together as it always did. Her next gun run was interrupted by multiple SAM launches, 3 missiles in quick succession that turned the sky into a deadly constellation of exhaust trails and proximity fuses. Switchblade found herself in a 3-dimensional chess game, using every defensive system and evasive technique in her considerable arsenal, while trying to maintain offensive pressure on the enemy positions. It was during this deadly dance that she heard the voice that would change everything, not from the ground, but from another aircraft. Switchblade, Paladin 2-3, we're 15 minutes out with a full load. Hold on down there. The cavalry was coming, but 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours given the deteriorating situation in the valley. Roger that, Paladin 2-3. Better make it fast, the neighborhood's getting unfriendly. Her response was calm despite the fact that she was currently inverted, diving toward the valley floor while trailing flares and chaff like a 4th of July celebration. The enemy had finally figured out that the key to survival was eliminating the aircraft that kept disrupting their attacks. Banking hard left to avoid yet another missile, Switchblade caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. A truck-mounted anti-aircraft gun setting up on the ridge line above the SEAL position. The twin-barreled 23 system could reach out and touch her at any altitude she cared to fly, and its radar was already painting her aircraft. She had perhaps seconds before it opened fire. Her last 2 Mavericks left the pylons in quick succession, their white-hot exhaust trails arcing across the valley toward the AA gun. The first missile struck the truck's cab, while the second eliminated the gun itself in a spectacular fireball that lit up the entire ridge line. But the victory was short-lived. Her weapons inventory was now down to guns only, and the ammunition counter showed less than 2,000 rounds remaining. Viper 6, what's your ammunition status? She knew the answer would be grim, but she had to ask. The SEAL team leader's response confirmed her fears. They were down to their last few magazines, with no resupply possible until the extraction helicopters arrived. It was going to come down to her guns and whatever tactical brilliance she could muster in the next few minutes. The storm chose that moment to reveal its full fury. Rain began falling in sheets, turning visibility to near zero even with night vision equipment. Lightning strobed through the clouds, its electromagnetic pulse temporarily scrambling her defensive systems. The wind gusted to 40 knots, buffeting her aircraft and making precision attacks nearly impossible. But still she pressed on, because 18 Americans were counting on her to hold the line until help arrived. Her radio crackled with new voices, the incoming close air support package checking in with Overlord. 2 more A-10s, call signs Paladin 2-3 and Paladin 2-4, plus an AC-130 gunship for sustained firepower. But they were still 12 minutes out, and a lot could happen in 12 minutes of close-quarters combat against a determined enemy. Switchblade, Overlord, be advised, we're tracking additional enemy movement from the north. Looks like a full company-sized element with vehicles. The news hit like a physical blow. A company meant over 100 fighters, possibly including armor and heavy weapons. Even with the cavalry coming, the odds were becoming impossible. But as she lined up for another gun run, Switchblade felt something she hadn't expected: absolute clarity. Fear fell away, replaced by pure focus on the task at hand. She was going to hold this valley, protect those SEALs, and prove that one pilot in the right aircraft at the right time could change the course of a battle. The enemy wanted a fight. She was about to give them more than they bargained for. The northern column appeared on her targeting pod as a string of heat signatures moving down the mountain road. Trucks, possibly armored vehicles, and what looked like a mobile artillery piece. Her remaining ammunition wouldn't be enough to stop them all, but she could slow them down, channel them, make them pay for every meter of ground they covered toward the SEAL position. Her first gun run on the column was a masterpiece of tactical aviation. Coming in low and fast from their blind side, she caught the lead vehicle with a long burst that sent it careening off the road in flames. The explosion blocked the narrow mountain track, creating an instant traffic jam that exposed the entire column to follow-up attacks. But return fire was immediate and intense. The enemy had learned to fear the distinctive sound of the GAU-8, and they responded with everything they had. Tracer rounds filled the air like deadly fireworks, while RPGs detonated around her aircraft in brilliant orange flowers. The A-10 shuddered under multiple impacts. Warning lights began illuminating on her instrument panel, and she could feel the aircraft's handling characteristics changing as flight control surfaces took damage. "Taking heavy damage," she reported, her voice still steady despite the chaos around her. Continuing attacks. The professionalism was bred into her bones. No matter how bad things got, you maintained radio discipline and kept fighting. That was what separated professionals from amateurs, what made the difference between victory and defeat. Her hydraulic system began failing first, a gradual loss of pressure that made the controls increasingly heavy and unresponsive. Then the left engine started running rough, its exhaust temperature climbing toward the red line. Most pilots would have broken off the attack, declared an emergency, and headed for home. But Switchblade could hear the desperation in Viper 6's voice as he called out new enemy positions, could visualize those 18 Americans fighting for their lives in the darkness below. She stayed in the fight, adapting her tactics to her aircraft's deteriorating condition. Instead of the graceful, swooping attacks that characterized healthy A-10 operations, she was reduced to straightened runs that traded maneuverability for firepower. Each attack became more dangerous as her ability to evade defensive fire diminished, but each burst from her gun bought precious minutes for the men on the ground. "Switchblade, your aircraft is streaming fluid," reported Overlord from above. The fluid was hydraulic, the lifeblood of her flight control systems. Without it, the A-10 would become increasingly difficult to control, eventually reaching the point where continued flight would be impossible. She was living on borrowed time, and everyone on the radio frequency knew it. But then came the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, the distant rumble of GAU-8s as Paladin 2-3 and 2-4 entered the battle. The cavalry had arrived, their fresh aircraft and full ammunition loads bringing new hope to the desperate situation in the valley. She could see their navigation lights through the storm, approaching from the south like angels of deliverance. "Switchblade, this is Paladin 2-3. We've got the northern column. You take a break and get that bird checked out." The voice belonged to Major Rick Hammer Davidson, her squadron commander and one of the most experienced A-10 pilots in the Air Force. His presence on the frequency filled her with relief. If anyone could finish this fight, it was Hammer and his wingman. But as she began to climb away from the valley, her left engine chose that moment to complete its mechanical death spiral. Fire warning lights illuminated her cockpit in angry red, and the engine's vibrations threatened to shake the aircraft apart. Emergency shutdown procedures flowed from muscle memory as she secured the failed power plant, but single-engine flight in an A-10 was challenging under the best circumstances. In a storm, at low altitude with battle damage, It bordered on the impossible. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Switchblade declaring an emergency. Left engine failure, multiple systems degraded, attempting return to base. The words felt strange in her mouth. After 8 months of combat operations, this was her first emergency declaration. The irony wasn't lost on her that it came on the night she'd flown her most important mission. Overlord's response was immediate and professional. Switchblade, roger your mayday. Squawk emergency, vectors to Bagram following. Emergency equipment standing by. But they both knew that reaching Bagram would require flying 90 miles over mountainous terrain in deteriorating weather conditions with a severely damaged aircraft. The smart money said she wouldn't make it. She proved the smart money wrong through a combination of skill, determination, and the kind of luck that only comes to those who refuse to quit when quitting makes sense. The flight back to Bagram took 37 minutes that felt like 37 hours, with every mountain peak a potential tombstone, and every wind gust a reminder of how close she was to losing control completely. The landing was controlled chaos, emergency vehicles racing alongside the runway, crash teams standing by, medical personnel waiting for what everyone assumed would be a catastrophic arrival. But Switchblade brought her wounded Warthog down with the same precision she'd used to eliminate enemy positions, the aircraft touching down smoothly despite missing half its flight control authority. As she taxied clear of the runway, Switchblade allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply and appreciate the simple fact of being alive. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her as the immediate danger passed. But through her headset, she could hear the battle in the Korangal Valley reaching its crescendo as fresh aircraft and ammunition turned the tide decisively in favor of the Americans. 23 minutes later, Overlord's voice crackled over the radio with the news everyone had been waiting for. All stations, this is Overlord. Viper 6 reports all hostiles neutralized, LZ secure for medevac. Outstanding work by all players tonight. The relief in his voice was unmistakable. 18 Americans were going home, and that was what mattered most. But it was Viper 6's personal transmission that brought tears to her eyes. Switchblade, this is Viper 6. Don't know your name, don't know your face, but I know you saved 18 lives tonight. When everyone else said wait for daylight, you came for us. My boys and I won't forget that, ever. The emotion in the SEAL leader's voice was raw, unfiltered gratitude from one warrior to another. Standing beside her battle-damaged aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by maintenance crews assessing the extent of the damage, Switchblade felt something she'd never experienced before, complete professional satisfaction. This was what she'd joined the Air Force for, what every training flight and practice mission had prepared her for. She'd answered the call when it mattered most, and 18 Americans were alive because of it. The debrief would come later, along with the accident investigation and the inevitable questions about her decision to launch into conditions that grounded other aircraft. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the knowledge that, when the chips were down and lives hung in the balance, she'd proven that courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about flying toward the sound of guns when your brothers needed you most. As the sun began to rise over the mountains of Afghanistan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Switchblade walked away from her aircraft knowing that she'd found her place in the long tradition of warriors who'd answered the call to serve something greater than themselves. The Korangal Valley would remember this night, and so would she, not for the fear or the danger, but for the moment when one pilot proved that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to someone willing to fly into hell to bring their people home.